Hello, everybody. Welcome back. I hope you all enjoyed the morning sessions. There's many more to come and quite a packed schedule for this afternoon. So there's lots in store. I hope you guys all enjoy that. To kick this off, we have a very special keynote. And I'm very grateful to introduce Ron Bodkin. Ron is the VP of AI Engineering and the CIO at the Vector Institute and is the engineering lead at the Schwartz Reisman Institute for Technology and Society. Ron is responsible for leading engineering teams that apply Vector's leading AI research to industry and healthcare problems for Canada, establishing and supporting world-class scientific computing infrastructure to scale the adoption of beneficial AI, and ensuring that all Vector users, sponsors, and participants and partners are upskilled and can use that effectively. Very, very privileged to welcome Ron to deliver this talk on responsible AI, and I'm going to let him in here.
Well, thank you, David. And it's nice to be here. Looking forward to talking with today about responsible AI. I think it's continues to be an incredibly important topic. So let me start by giving a quick agenda. I'm going to touch a little bit on the opportunity from AI, and needless to say, machine learning is the technology that's really advancing capabilities in AI in the world. So when I talk about AI, machine learning is the key aspect that's going to really be important. I'll talk a little bit about some of the harms or wrongs that happen with AI, some of the categories and areas where this is happening, and how we can be responsible, and wrap up with the conclusion. Deep learning has led to significant advances in AI in the last few years. Things like massive natural language models like GPT-3 are showing really interesting emergent behavior, more powerful models that are showing the ability to do things like few-shot learning. The use of computer vision techniques based on deep learning are creating significant breakthroughs, whether it be work on autonomous vehicles, connected vehicles, as well as in a variety of other industries and applications like consumer phone applications, as an example. We're seeing advances in robotics, speech recognition and interaction, and healthcare, area that obviously is of great importance at Vector. Enhancing radiology, identifying ticks that have Lyme disease or may have Lyme disease, and even predicting clinical conditions like cardiac arrest in advance to improve quality of care. And of course, another area in healthcare that's top of mind in the middle of this terrible pandemic is applying AI to fight COVID-19 and to improve public health response. All topics that I'm sure to many attendees here are very familiar, but I want to start by, of course, acknowledging the positive role AI can play in our economy and our industry and in healthcare. So that when I talk a little bit here about some of what can go wrong, it's in a context of understanding that there's a lot of benefit that we can have from AI, but we need to get it right. So one of the areas that has become much more visible in the last few years, but is worth emphasizing, is the risk of unfair bias from AI. And indeed, it's not just AI systems. Unfair bias is a systemic problem in our society. It can come about from human-driven processes. It can come about from simple rules. It can come about from logistic regression. It isn't a unique problem to machine learning, but it is a problem, and it's something that we need to do better. And with machine learning systems, there's more complexity and more challenges sometimes in addressing these harms. So bias, examples like the Apple Card issue about gender discrimination being observed in how they were processing applications that led to an investigation, or another study last year showing mortgage discrimination against Hispanic and Black applicants paying an unfair premium in mortgage interest, if 8 basis points on new purchases, leading to almost $1 billion in extra interest were being paid per year because of discrimination in the fintech algorithms. Example of Amazon a few years ago built a machine learning based tool for screening resumes, but found that it had gender bias against women. Another one was last year in Scientific American, a study showing a US-based healthcare risk algorithm was biased because it was assessing risk based on actual spend on healthcare. So it was underrating the risk of Black patients for healthcare because they had been undertreated in past and therefore were viewed as less likely to be needing healthcare expense. So it was an interesting, unfortunate example of a kind of bias in outcomes data. Another kind of bias that comes up that is a concern is representational harm. Rather than giving different kinds of outcomes based on different categories, it can be simply having poor performance or being misrepresented. Not so long ago, if you did a Google search for CEO, you saw an array of white men. Google has addressed that because it is representational harm to have a suggestion that CEOs are predominantly of a given background, but you don't have to dig far to still see the same problem in Google search, right? I showed this example a few weeks ago. I ran that search of mechanics and saw predominantly males, for example, not necessarily representative of a balance. A similar example of representational harm. There was a model that is filling in a generative model that's trying to fill in an ambiguous image. So a blurred image of Barack Obama on the left, this model trying to create a super resolution output turns it into a white man, which is indicative, of course, of a representational bias towards whites in this data set. In a similar way, high quality natural language models like GPT-3 have a lot of bias built in. So with some prompting, this wasn't like the first example, but nonetheless, they were able to, this researcher was able to get it to say offensive things, with some prompting. So these are all examples of bias where it's not directly affecting a decision, but is harmful to people. Similarly, the example of a few years ago of having photos that showed a photo recognition application that misclassified people of color as gorillas. But there's other examples where AI is having a negative effect. AI is playing a key role in the dissemination of information in social media and in video sharing sites, and creating filter bubbles, polarization, addiction, promoting violence, promoting conspiracy theories. These are significant harms, right? And I think part of maybe what's worth observing is the aggregate effect is pretty significant, even though it wasn't that long ago that people would have argued that recommendation algorithms, ranking search results, ranking items in a news feed would be low risk, low stakes decisions, but in aggregate, they're having a big effect on our society. In addition to them, another area where there's clearly ethical concern is there are ways of applying AI systems that are simply problematic. Things like automated AI weapon systems, where there's already evidence of work like this Kalashnikov gun on the bottom left that automatically targets and fires, where an AI arms race of automated weapons without humans in the loop is risky, or indeed surveillance dictatorships, like the Chinese system, where increasing amounts of Chinese society are subject to continuous surveillance and tracking. Even the social credit system, right? AI systems can play a negative role. So these are a few examples of some of the different kinds of harms or wrongs that can come about from AI, ranging from unintended consequences through to deliberate misuse. I'm going to focus more, assuming that we're going to talk about how to be responsible in a context of having good intention, but just trying to be responsible, trying to address bad actors and their use of AI is something that's less of a choice for individual companies and organizations applying AI and much more of a government policy issue in my mind. So let's focus on what we can do in terms of focusing on responsibility and how to act. So I think organizations really need to think about this in layers, right? Having a basic strategy around what are their principles and embracing the importance of responsibility in applying AI, then having a real process that includes governance and inclusion around how to integrate responsibility into the use of AI in the organization, and then supported by the right kind of technology, including responsibility by design, integrating tools and standards. One of the things I think is really important to think about in this vein is responsibility is a complex concern, right? It's not a binary quality. There isn't a simple engineering fix to solve responsibility. So instead, it's something where we always have to be thinking about what are the risks, how do we improve, how do we make things better, and it needs to be a partnership between technology experts and business leaders in order to be successful. So I would say, at the strategy level, starting by establishing ethical codes, right? There's a number of different ethical codes that have been put forward around AI, and I think they can be inspiring for any organization, but starting by at least having a clear charter and understanding of what you will and won't do is important. So is having a sense of accountability. How will leadership, technical experts, domain experts, researchers, regulators, what will the roles be? How do they come together to make sure that you're going to meet your expectations? What do you expect of each in order to drive responsibility? And from a process standpoint, I think it's important to start with inclusion. That means, one way, for example, to minimize bias is to make sure you have diverse perspectives and you have, therefore, more people that have different backgrounds and will be more likely to identify gaps in your thinking or cases you're not addressing, data set oversights or use cases that didn't occur, different metrics that could be important to look at, and likewise, including varied disciplines, right? I think one of the areas where I often see irresponsibility, inadvertent harm coming about is where you have technical teams that are working based on a specification from the business and not questioning that and sort of trying to implement an objective, and business teams that don't feel they understand the technology and do not feel that they understand or can influence or steer. And then sort of a nobody's at the wheel situation where no one's thinking about what's the end-to-end effect of the system. So the critical need is to then create cross-functional teams that work together with a variety of disciplines, deep domain knowledge, and a healthy dialogue about consequences, including unintended consequences. To provide that oversight, then you need to have project reviews, design reviews. You should be looking at multiple metrics. One really important rule is that when you optimize a dependent variable, other independent variables will tend to be driven to extreme values, right? And this is a reason why a lot of times we have unintended consequences, that we assume that if we optimize, for example, optimize clicks in a online system, we'll often assume that things will continue to be roughly as average as we've experienced them. But it turns out that optimizing for clicks, you will promote extreme content because it tends to drive better interest, more emotional response, right? So you can't assume that by optimizing for clicks, you're going to still get average content. It's going to change and tend to select for extreme values. Having multiple metrics to understand the health of the system and in effect is a good warning sign. It obviously needs to be integrated into things like risk analysis, security reviews. And I think another important thing is to have good standards, which means, yes, documentation, but as much as possible, how do you start to drive more automation, more continuous checking, more checking of metrics, like establishing your fairness metrics and how do you track them and watch over time as feedback loops come into play. And indeed, how do you have things like adversarial testing, red teams that really attempt to find weaknesses in your AI systems? From a technology standpoint, there's a variety of approaches around and great research on interpretability, right? So at least being able to surface interpretability so that data scientists can understand it, to try to do it by, I think, emerging directions important is more interpretability by design, figuring out like what it was to make a medical decision. What does the doctor need to see to be guided and be helpful, or to investigate a risk of fraud? What does an investigator need in order to have confidence, or for a consumer to be able to, as there's increasing interest, for example, in proposed reforms to Canadian private sector regulation of privacy, to give consumers a right to an explanation. What do you need to give a consumer so that they can understand the decision that affected them, right? Similarly, around fairness, there's a rich area of research, research at Vector on things like representation learning that can make it possible to have to come up with an adversarial tested way of representing information that doesn't let you reconstruct protected attributes and still produces useful machine learning models is promising, right? Is one way of remediating. But look, a lot of times, even just looking at the data, analyzing it, having clear metrics of fairness, clear a sense of, you can't hit among even for classifiers, there's not a single definition of fairness that is consistent with all others, right? So you often have trade-offs. So what are you looking for? What do you think is fair? How are you going to measure it? Similarly, in privacy, there's a lot of advances around understanding privacy, applying techniques like differential privacy, even techniques like federated learning, distributed learning that can preserve privacy and confidentiality with machine learning that I think will become increasingly important. And so likewise, more broad safety and quality concerns. One thing I think is important too is this notion of value alignment, which is, very much how do you make sure that the proxy objectives you're optimizing in your machine learning systems are aligned with the actual values you have? How can you use secondary metrics to identify gaps? Sometimes that means doing more work on refining the actual loss functions or objective functions, as well as constraints around what you won't do in some dependent variables or some secondary metrics of result of the system to have good outcomes. So these are all areas of technology that can be brought to bear. So I would say the conclusion is, that implementing responsible AI is urgent, right? We're seeing significant effect from AI systems in society. And at the same time, I see more and more organizations that would get tremendous value from applying state-of-the-art deep learning techniques shying away because they don't have their arms around responsibility. They don't have the governance. They don't understand how to get the interpretability they need. They don't know how to create the partnership between the business and the technology teams. They don't know how to assess and verify fairness, right? So to retain the trust of stakeholders, to be able to actually unlock the value of AI, this is critical, to prevent reputational harm and more broadly so that AI lands in a positive way and continues to create value in society. But to do it, it requires support from leadership, from technical experts, domain experts, regulators, and researchers. So I would just conclude that it's important for organizations to take responsibility, to define a strategy, a process, and technology to do so, right? To broaden participation, to include and empower diverse perspectives and professionals, to increase transparency and interpretability for key stakeholders, non-technical stakeholders as well, right? And to really keep an eye on outcomes, right? To not take a perspective that once you've built a AI system, you're done, but you need to be carefully monitoring it, addressing, what are the unintended consequences? How are feedback loops landing? Address, do you need to adjust and modify the objectives of your system based on unexpected consequences? All really important areas. So with that, that leaves just a few minutes here at the end for any questions. So please, if you have any questions, let me just switch over to this. I don't, feel free to throw any questions into the chat. Other than that, while we're waiting for questions, maybe I can go back and talk a little bit more about some of the technology. So let me go back and touch on a few points since we don't yet have any questions in dialogue. I think that the area of privacy that I touched on briefly, that's been an area that there's been a lot of interesting research, right? Federated learning provides good capabilities, to allow you to have, for example, consortia where they are not allowed to share individual data, but they might want to collaborate, like for a healthcare consortium or for attacking financial crimes and fraud, to be able to share models, to improve models working together without sharing sensitive data, right, as an example. And I see now we've got some questions coming in. So Debbie asks, how well are companies doing right now in implementing responsible AI? And I would say that there's a ton of interest, right? I think there's a lot of hunger from companies to understand how to implement responsible AI, but that there's often not a clarity around what are the ways? How do you govern it? What's the scope? What are the metrics? Who should be responsible? So I think there's progress, and there's a lot of organizations that are thinking about it and wanting to invest, but there's a need for a lot of execution, right, and a lot of guidance, right? And it's one of the things I love to hear about, even offline, is what are the stumbling blocks that organizations are running into in making progress on that agenda. I've identified some of the ones I think are important. And Tina asks, how do you increase the visibility of responsible AI to upper management who may not have this on the radar, right? And I think in some sense, flagging some of the problems that occur, right? Like my slide showing the harms, sort of identify, look, these are reputational harms that can happen. Look at what's happened when organizations have deployed AI systems and have been called out for discrimination of one form or another, or for not having enough safety and adversarial actors, subvert a chatbot and make it say offensive things, right? These kinds of situations, I think can help raise it on the radar. I think a lot of times the upper management are broadly aware of the importance of AI. And so another angle is simply to identify that it's actually a key element of enabling value from the AI investments is putting that investment and responsibility in and being proactive. And then let's see, I think we just enough time for one or two more questions. Michelle asks, can you discuss some of the ways that the Vector Institute is engaging sectors with AI that traditionally haven't embraced technology, like law or education? I would say, I think, in the area of law, I know that we have sponsors like Thomson Reuters that are providers to the law profession, and they've been involved, for example, in a collaboration project we did on natural language processing, and in fact, there's a case study about how the experience in applying some of the state-of-the-art transformer-based models for language understanding allowed them to improve products that they're providing into those sectors. So some of it is, we work with sponsors, whether it be them or some of the professional services firms that are sponsors that can then bring some of the AI capabilities to those markets, as well as the research that we're publishing, we think is broadly useful, and by creating an engineering function, we're trying to reduce the barriers from adopting some of the state-of-the-art AI research. So I guess one last question. Erica asks, how do we currently support Vector sponsors on the responsible AI journey, and what holds them back from doing so? And I would say, we see a lot of aspects, we've been involved in creating collaboration projects around defining more standards for responsible AI. We're looking forward to another project like that next year. We're talking a lot with our sponsors about some of the specific techniques around things like interpretability and privacy and fairness. We often will provide research insights, so connect sponsors with research that's relevant in these areas. And I would say that what's holding back a lot of organizations is simply maturity and understanding practically how do you get started. So maybe the last thing I'd leave everyone with is, getting started. Start a pilot project, right? Pick an area and see if you can pick a way of starting to build your organizational awareness and capability to apply some of these techniques. So, acting now and looking at how can you pilot is a great place to start. So thank you all for the great questions and for your time here today.
Thank you, Ron. I really appreciate it. I think I can collectively say we're all very excited to see what happens over the next couple months and year with you, with the Vector Institute. We know that they're doing fantastic research. It's extremely exciting to see that they've paired up to explore the engineering capabilities. We all know that this has been a huge issue over the past couple of years for a lot of the people that are doing working on the research side. So it's very exciting. And obviously responsible AI is a huge issue, and it's refreshing to see that you're focused on this and the Vector Institute's focused on making sure that this is a priority for those working on AI and the partner companies and so on. So thank you so much, Ron. I'll let you get on with your day. And for the rest of those attendees who are here, thank you so much for your great questions. We're going to continue on with the other sessions. And yes, thank you, Ron. We'll be in touch.